My first memory was in the back seat of my parents' Honda Odyssey, staring out at the rows of vibrant green trees, clashing with the greyish-blue sky as they zipped past. I think we were coming back from church, based on how everyone was dressed. My parents spoke in hushed tones in the front seat, anger in my dad's, sadness in my mum's. They would occasionally look back at me with soft smiles. My mum would reach back and hold my hand in hers. Even back then, I knew something wasn't quite right. For the next several years, I would sleep in between my parents. By the time I was 10 or 11, I felt like I was too big for their bed and wanted my own room. The most I could get was a separate bed, adjacent to my parents'. It was only when I turned 15 when I was finally allowed to sleep in my own room. It was such a great feeling to finally have the office room in my house converted into a bedroom. Finally, 2 doors between myself and my dad's elephant-like snoring. I got all my clothes, makeup, magazines and books from the loft and began to decorate my own room. In the corner of the room, I saw a newly installed black video camera with a blinking red light. I sprinted to the living room to ask what it was for. He pressed the button on the remote and the football game was replaced by a black screen. "Grace, don't worry about it. They are just to keep you safe." "Safe from what, Dad?" I asked, forehead furrowed. "We live in a good neighbourhood. You already have a ton of cameras around the house. Why my room too?" He sat up in the brown leather sofa and his eyes met mine with a kind but stern gaze. "Trust me, I pray every day that you'll never have to find out." I stopped questioning him after that. A few weeks later, I met what Dad was protecting me from. I went to bed just like any other night, brushed my teeth, took off my makeup, and had a good night chat with my new boyfriend. After waking up to a particularly scary dream, I opened my eyes to see scattered shadows painting my room. I could see the time was 2:57 a.m. Wiping the sweat off my head, I began to turn over to go to bed. Before I could complete the motion, I saw something near my doorway. A shadow. I froze, hoping it hadn't noticed I could see it. The shape was obviously female, but it was far too short to be either of my parents. I was too scared to say or do anything, so I waited. I laid there with my eyes squinted, doing my best impression of someone fast asleep. I almost screamed for my parents, but having just gotten my new room, I decided against it. Eventually, I fell asleep. Several months passed again with no incident. I chalked it up to a bad dream and quickly forgot about it. In that time, I began to lose a lot of weight for some reason. It got to the point where many of my clothes stopped fitting. My mum finally stopped me one day after school. "Hey Grace, you look very tired these days. Have you been eating enough? Is everything okay at school?" "Yeah, Mum, I've been eating. Everything's good," I said impatiently. She paused for a second after that, looking at me with a sad expression. "You know we can talk about anything, right?" I paused as well, thinking about my frightening experience with a shadow in my room. I decided it was not worth bothering them about it. "Yeah, I know, Mum. I'll let you know if I need to talk," I said quickly as I grabbed a snack from the fridge and went up to my room. As I got upstairs and started eating my yogurt and peanut butter crackers, I noticed something in the wood floor by my doorway. 2 sets of 3 deep scratches. Propelled by a mixture of fear and curiosity, I immediately jumped from my desk and went to go check them out. They looked to be spaced apart as if some type of mountain lion had stood there on its hind legs. The only difference, the claw marks were deeper than any animal I had ever seen. Each mark had to be as deep as the first segment of my index finger. "Hey Mum, could you come take a look at this?" I called. I looked up as my mum arrived, but by the time we both looked back down, they weren't there. The only marks we saw were some tiny scratches, not uncommon for how old the wood floors are in my house. My mum still looked concerned. "Grace, are you sure you're okay? I think we should move you back to our room. You can keep your room just how it is and come here whenever you want." After spending far too much time pleading with both my mum and, when he got home, my dad, they finally agreed to let me keep my room for the time being. Though I was relieved to keep my freedom, I still couldn't shake how real and terrifying those claw marks looked. 2 nights after that, I found out who the shadow had belonged to. I had an uneasy feeling in my stomach that night. I found it extremely difficult to get to bed with thoughts of those claw marks and what they might have belonged to swirling around in my head. After at least 3 hours of attempting to fall asleep, I had finally begun to doze off. Just before I could, she appeared in front of my eyes. This time, much closer. She looked down at me with a blank expression on her youthful face. The face looked like a human's, except far too perfect. A perfectly symmetrical face, porcelain skin with not one blemish on it, long black hair draped on either side of her head. Her eyes glowed a shade of beautiful cerulean. I was locked in her gaze for what felt like hours, again too terrified to move. This time, there was no hiding the fact that I was awake and could see her watching me. Looking down her frame, draped in a white nightgown, I saw what made the claw marks from earlier. Her feet resembled human feet, except for only having 3 toes. Sticking from each toe were massive claws. The same claws protruded from each finger on her hands as well. Her stance resembled a goat, heels in the air and all of her weight balanced on the toes. Her perfect face broke into a grin, or what was an approximation of one. The smile was just as pristine as the rest of her, producing an uncanny, doll-like visage. She slowly reached a pale hand up towards me and lightly stroked my face with just enough force that I could feel how sharp the claws were. The sensation broke me out of my frozen stupor. I screamed as loud as I could, practically tearing my vocal cords in the process. Just a second after, my dad burst into the room in just his underwear, his dishevelled hair scattered in all directions. He turned on the light with one hand and held a large white cross in the other. The entity slowly turned to face him, tearing up the floor panels in the process. "Get the fuck away from my daughter!" he screamed in a booming voice as he held the cross and walked towards her. I imagined how terrified my dad must have been as she began to walk towards him as well. I saw her arm reach towards him, but before she could make contact, he pressed the cross towards her and began to pray. "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armour of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil," he began to shout. My mum had arrived at that point and was placing her hands on him in support. The creature screamed as steam erupted from her head. "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil." In a flash of steam and light, she vanished, leaving behind a putrid smell of rot. "Sharon, get the sage!" my dad yelled frantically as he ran over to me to make sure I was okay. "I'm fine, Dad," I managed to muster. "She only touched my face." Colour drained from his face after that. "Come on, Grace, let's get up." After that incident, I had no objections over staying in my parents' room for the rest of my life. "Guys, get your shoes. Let's go on a drive to clear our heads," my dad said quickly as he grabbed several things from his closet. Holy water, crosses, more sage, a few Bibles. We got out of the house as fast as we could and jumped into the car. I shivered violently, looking at the bright square of my bedroom window as the car peeled out of the driveway. We were on the freeway before anyone said anything. "Guys, what was that?" I asked in a quiet, defeated voice. My mum was the first to speak. After seeing a quick nod from my dad, she said, "Grace, I think it's time we told you. We were told you were cursed when you were a baby. The moment we first brought you to church, the pastor would not even allow you to be baptized. He said that something malevolent is haunting you and will eventually take you away." She began to cry and held my hand. "We tried to protect you for a long time. That's why we kept you as close as possible. We didn't want to give it a chance to take you. The only advice the pastor gave us was to guard you at all times. She can only get you if you are alone." I began to cry too. I had noticed my hands in her grasp were even more frail than before. My face in the rearview mirror was bony and my eyes sunken. My dad continued, "We are going to protect you, okay? We'll stick together so she can never attack you again. If you ever feel scared, I will teach you the same prayer I used to get rid of her this time." His voice seemed less confident than his words. I nodded, blinking away my tears. Despite the fact that the incident had nothing to do with our house, we decided a change of scenery would help calm everyone's nerves. My parents took time off work so we could go on a small family vacation. It was difficult to get our minds off of the demon, but eventually we were able to. In fact, it was almost fun. We got a hotel near a beach in a nearby city, just like old times. We shared a king-size bed. I slept between them. Instead of feeling smothered like I used to, I now felt protected. I constantly reminded myself that she couldn't get me if they kept guard. That changed last night. It was a few nights into our vacation, and we had gotten ready for bed. It was just 15 minutes or so after my parents had slept. I was beginning to fall asleep as well. I blinked as my eyes grew heavy. I felt an intense sensation of falling and jolted awake to see her, right above me, on the ceiling. The claws on her hands and feet were firmly planted in the ceiling, but she still faced me with her head tilted in the most unnatural angle. Her long hair fell over her head, but I could still see that perfect, doll face peering at me with unblinking eyes. This time, I wasn't able to move an inch. I tried with all my effort to shake my body awake, but there was no chance. I was completely locked in this staring contest with the demon. I felt for the ability to move my face muscles to scream for help, but I found I could just barely move my lips. I was not able to scream or even talk, but I found all my strength to move my lips in a whisper. "Be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armour of God, that you may be able to stand." I stopped my prayer in horror as I noticed the glee on her face. Her mouth was moving to mimic the exact words coming out of my mouth. To the letter. By this time, both my parents had woken up and realised something was wrong. My dad had already pulled out both his holy water and cross, and had begun to recite the same prayer as his wide eyes were locked on the demon. My mother grabbed me and we fled to the other corner of the room, clutching some of the holy water as well. "Finally, be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might. Put on the whole armour of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil." As he held up the cross and said the prayers, she leapt off the ceiling, about 4 feet away from my dad. Her head was cocked to the side in what almost seemed like amusement. As she heard the last word of the prayer, she responded, "That won't work on me anymore. I'm too powerful now." She walked towards my dad as he held the cross out again. She laughed again as she pressed her own forehead to it. Nothing happened. "That won't work either," she said with a sinister smile as my dad splashed all of the holy water on her. She let out a horrible witch-like cackle, and then, before my dad could react, lurched forward and grabbed his throat, pressing him against the wall. "Grace, Sharon, run!" he gasped as her grip tightened. "I almost have all of her soul now. If you let me finish a job now, I'll let you live. She won't survive either way." "I'll never let you take her," he spat. My dad fought until the end. He groaned and tried to punch and claw back. I'll never forget his last cries as my mum and I crawled out of the window and ran as fast as we could to the car. We're currently on the road as I type this. It's been nearly 2 days of non-stop driving. We have been frantically searching for clues as to what this thing is and how to stop it. Does anyone know what this creature might be? I need to find out before it's too late. Even as I look into my car's mirror right now, I can see my face slowly change. My cheekbones are getting more and more prominent. I am slowly losing strength, even as I write this. I don't have much time left.